Part 4, Place Names, The Name. Section 5. I had always within reach a plan of Paris, which, because I could see drawn on it the street in which Monsieur and Madame Swann lived, seemed to me to contain a secret treasure. And to please myself, as well as by a sort of chivalrous loyalty, in any connection or with no relevance at all, I would repeat the name of that street until my father, not being, like my mother and grandmother, in the secret of my love, would ask, "But why are you always talking about that street? There's nothing wonderful about it. It is an admirable street to live in because it's only a few minutes' walk from the Bois, but there are a dozen other streets just the same." I made every effort to introduce the name of Swann into my conversation with my parents. In my own mind, of course, I never ceased to murmur it, but I needed also to hear its exquisite sound, and to make myself play that chord, the voiceless rendering of which did not suffice me. Moreover, that name of Swann, with which I had for so long been familiar, was to me now, as happens at times to people suffering from aphasia in the case of the most ordinary words, the name of something new. It was forever present in my mind, which could not, however, grow accustomed to it. I analyzed it, I spelt it, its orthography came to me as a surprise, and with its familiarity it had simultaneously lost its innocence. The pleasure that I derived from the sound of it I felt to be so guilty that it seemed to me as though the others must read my thoughts, and would change the conversation if I endeavored to guide it in that direction. I fell back upon subjects which still brought me into touch with Gilberte. I eternally repeated the same words, and it was no use my knowing that they were but words, words uttered in her absence, which she could not hear, words without virtue in themselves, repeating what were, indeed, facts, but powerless to modify them, for still it seemed to me that by dint of handling, of stirring in this way everything that had reference to Gilberte, I might perhaps make emerge from it something that would bring me happiness. I told my parents again that Gilberte was very fond of her governess, as if the statement, when repeated for the 100th time, would at last have the effect of making Gilberte suddenly burst into the room, come to live with us forever. I had already sung the praises of the old lady who read the debates. I had hinted to my parents that she must at least be an ambassador's widow, if not actually a highness, and I continued to descant on her beauty, her splendor, her nobility, until the day on which I mentioned that by what I had heard Gilberte call her, she appeared to be a Madame Blatin. "Oh, now I know whom you mean," cried my mother, while I felt myself grow red all over with shame. On guard, as your grandfather says. And so it's she that you think so wonderful? Why, she's perfectly horrible, and always has been. She's the widow of a bailiff. You can't remember when you were little all the trouble I used to have to avoid her at your gymnastic lessons, where she was always trying to get hold of me. I didn't know the woman, of course, to tell me that you were much too nice looking for a boy. She has always had an insane desire to get to know people, and she must be quite insane, as I have always thought, if she really does know Madame Swann. For even if she does come of very common people, I have never heard anything said against her character, but she must always be forcing herself upon strangers. She is really a horrible woman, frightfully vulgar, and besides she is always creating awkward situations. As for Swann, in my attempts to resemble him, I spent the whole time, when I was at table, in drawing my finger along my nose and in rubbing my eyes. My father would exclaim, "The child's a perfect idiot. He's becoming quite impossible." More than all else I should have liked to be as bold as Swann. He appeared to me to be a creature so extraordinary that I found it impossible to believe that people whom I knew, and often saw, knew him also, and that in the course of the day any one might run against him. And once my mother, while she was telling us, as she did every evening at dinner, where she had been and what she had done that afternoon, merely by the words, "By the way, guess whom I saw at the Three Quarters, at the umbrella counter, Swann," caused to burst open in the midst of her narrative, an arid desert to me, a mystic blossom. What a melancholy satisfaction to learn that, that very afternoon, threading through the crowd his supernatural form, Swann had gone to buy an umbrella. Among the events of the day, great and small, but all equally unimportant, That one alone aroused in me those peculiar vibrations by which my love for Gilberte was invariably stirred. My father complained that I took no interest in anything, because I did not listen while he was speaking of the political developments that might follow the visit of King Theodosius, at that moment in France as the nation's guest, and, it was hinted, ally. And yet how intensely interested I was to know whether Swann had been wearing his hooded cape. "Did you speak to him?" I asked. "Why, of course I did," answered my mother, who always seemed afraid lest, were she to admit that we were not on the warmest of terms with Swann, people would seek to reconcile us more than she cared for, in view of the existence of Madame Swann, whom she did not wish to know. "It was he who came up and spoke to me. I hadn't seen him." "Then you haven't quarreled?" "Quarreled? What on earth made you think that we had quarreled?" she briskly parried, as though I had cast doubt on the fiction of her friendly relations with Swann, and was planning an attempt to bring them together. "He might be cross with you for never asking him here." "One isn't obliged to ask every one to one's house, you know. Has he ever asked me to his? I don't know his wife." "But he used often to come at Combray." "I should think he did. He used to come at Combray, and now in Paris he has something better to do, and so have I. But I can promise you, we didn't look in the least like people who had quarreled. We were kept waiting there for some time while they brought him his parcel. He asked after you. He told me you had been playing with his daughter." My mother went on, amazing me with the portentous revelation of my own existence in Swann's mind. Far more than that, of my existence in so complete, so material a form, that when I stood before him trembling with love in the Champs Elysees, he had known my name, and who my mother was, and had been able to blend with my quality as his daughter's playmate certain facts with regard to my grandparents and their connections, the place in which we lived, certain details of our past life, all of which I myself perhaps did not know. But my mother did not seem to have noticed anything particularly attractive in that counter at the Three Quarters, where she had represented to Swann, at the moment in which he caught sight of her, a definite person with whom he had sufficient memories in common to impel him to come up to her and to speak. Nor did either she or my father seem to find any occasion now to mention Swann's family, the grandparents of Gilberte, nor to use the title of stockbroker, topics than which nothing else gave me so keen a pleasure. My imagination had isolated and consecrated in the social Paris a certain family, just as it had set apart in the structural Paris a certain house, on whose porch it had fashioned sculptures and made its windows precious. But these ornaments I alone had eyes to see. Just as my father and mother looked upon the house in which Swann lived as one that closely resembled the other houses built at the same period in the neighborhood of the Bois, so Swann's family seemed to them to be in the same category as many other families of stockbrokers. Their judgment was more or less favorable according to the extent to which the family in question shared in merits that were common to the rest of the universe, and there was about it nothing that they could call unique. What, on the other hand, they did appreciate in the Swanns they found in equal, if not in greater measure elsewhere. And so, after admitting that the house was in a good position, they would go on to speak of some other house that was in a better, but had nothing to do with Gilberte or of financiers on a larger scale than her grandfather had been. And if they had appeared for a moment to be of my opinion, that was a mistake which was very soon corrected, for in order to distinguish in all Gilberte's surroundings an indefinable quality, analogous, in the scale of emotions, to what in the scale of colors is called infra-red, a supplementary sense of perception was required, with which love, for the time being, had endowed me, and this my parents lacked. On the days when Gilberte had warned me that she would not be coming to the Champs Elysees, I would try to arrange my walks so that I should be brought into some kind of contact with her. Sometimes I would lead Françoise on a pilgrimage to the house in which the Swanns lived, making her repeat to me unendingly all that she had learned from the governess with regard to Madame Swann. It seems she puts great faith in medals. She would never think of starting on a journey if she had heard an owl hoot, or the death watch in the wall, or if she had seen a cat at midnight, or if the furniture had creaked. Oh, yes, she's a most religious lady, she is. I was so madly in love with Gilberte that if, on our way, I caught sight of their old butler taking the dog out, my emotion would bring me to a standstill. I would fasten on his white whiskers eyes that melted with passion, and Françoise would rouse me with, "What's wrong with you now, child?" and we would continue on our way until we reached their gate, where a porter, different from every other porter in the world, and saturated, even to the braid on his livery, with the same melancholy charm that I had felt to be latent in the name of Gilberte, looked at me as though he knew that I was one of those whose natural unworthiness would forever prevent them from penetrating into the mysteries of the life inside, which it was his duty to guard, and over which the ground floor windows appeared conscious of being protectingly closed, with far less resemblance between the nobly sweeping arches of their muslin curtains to any other windows in the world than to Gilberte's glancing eyes. On other days we would go along the boulevards, and I would post myself at the corner of the Rue du Faux. I had heard that Swann was often to be seen passing there on his way to the dentist's, and my imagination so far differentiated Gilberte's father from the rest of humanity, his presence in the midst of a crowd of real people introduced among them so miraculous an element, that even before we reached the Madeleine I would be trembling with emotion at the thought that I was approaching a street from which that supernatural apparition might at any moment burst upon me unawares. But most often of all, on days when I was not to see Gilberte, as I had heard that Madame Swann walked almost every day along the Allée des Acacias, round the big lake, and in the Allée de la Reine Marguerite, I would guide Françoise in the direction of Bois de Boulogne. It was to me like one of those zoological gardens in which one sees assembled together a variety of flora, and contrasted effects in landscape, where from a hill one passes to a grotto, a meadow, rocks, a stream, a trench, another hill, a marsh, but knows that they are there only to enable the hippopotamus, zebra, crocodile, rabbit, bear, and heron to disport themselves in a natural or a picturesque setting. This, the Bois, equally complex, uniting a multitude of little worlds, distinct and separate, placing a stage set with red trees, American oaks, like an experimental forest in Virginia, next to a fir wood by the edge of the lake, or to a forest grove from which would suddenly emerge, in her lissom covering of firs, with the large appealing eyes of a dumb animal, a hastening walker, was the Garden of Woman, and like the myrtle alley in the Aeneid, planted for their delight with trees of one kind only, the Allée des Acacias was thronged by the famous beauties of the day. As from a long way off the sight of the jutting crag from which it dives into the pool thrills with joy the children who know that they are going to behold the seal, long before I reach the acacia alley, their fragrance, scattered abroad, would make me feel that I was approaching the incomparable presence of a vegetable personality, strong and tender. Then, as I drew near, the sight of their topmost branches, their lightly tossing foliage, and its easy grace, its coquettish outline, its delicate fabric, over which hundreds of flowers were laid, like winged and throbbing colonies of precious insects, and finally their name itself, feminine, indolent, and seductive, made my heart beat, but with a social longing, like those waltzes which remind us only of the names of the fair dancers, called aloud as they entered the ballroom. I had been told that I should see in the alley certain women of fashion, who, in spite of their not all having husbands, were constantly mentioned in conjunction with Madame Swann, but most often by their professional names, their new names, when they had any, being but a sort of incognito, a veil which those who would speak of them were careful to draw aside, so as to make themselves understood, thinking that beauty, in the order of feminine elegance, was governed by occult laws into the knowledge of which they had been initiated, and that they had the power to realize it, I accepted before seeing them, like the truth of a coming revelation, the appearance of their clothes, of their carriages and horses, of 1,000 details among which I placed my faith, as in an inner soul which gave the cohesion of a work of art to that ephemeral and changing pageant. But it was Madame Swann whom I wished to see, and I waited for her to go past, as deeply moved as though she were Gilberte, whose parents, saturated, like everything in her environment, with her own special charm, excited in me as keen a passion as she did herself, indeed a still more painful disturbance, since their point of contact with her was that intimate, that internal part of her life which was hidden from me. And furthermore, for I very soon learned, as we shall see in due course, that they did not like my playing with her, that feeling of veneration which we always have for those who hold, and exercise without restraint, the power to do us an injury. I assigned the first place, in the order of aesthetic merit and of social grandeur, to simplicity, when I saw Madame Swann on foot, in a polonaise of plain cloth, a little toque on her head, trimmed with a pheasant's wing, a bunch of violets in her bosom, hastening along the Allée des Acacias as if it had been merely the shortest way back to her own house, and acknowledging with a rapid glance the courtesy of the gentlemen in carriages, who, recognizing her figure at a distance, were raising their hats to her, and saying to one another that there was never any one so well turned out as she. But instead of simplicity, it was to ostentation that I must assign the first place, if, after I had compelled Françoise, who could hold out no longer, and complained that her legs were giving beneath her, to stroll up and down with me for another hour, I saw at length, emerging from the Porte Dauphine, figuring for me a royal dignity, the passage of a sovereign, and impressions such as no real queen has ever since been able to give me, because my notion of their power has been less vague and more founded upon experience, borne along by the flight of a pair of fiery horses, slender and shapely as one sees them in the drawings of Constantin Guise, carrying on its box an enormous coachman, furred like a Cossack, and by his side a diminutive groom, like Toby, the late Baudenoord's tiger. I saw, or rather I felt its outlines engraved upon my heart by a clean and killing stab, a matchless Victoria, built rather high, and hinting, through the extreme modernity of its appointments, at the forms of an earlier day, deep down in which lay negligently backed Madame Swann, her hair, now quite pale with one gray lock, girt with a narrow band of flowers, usually violets, from which floated down long veils, a lilac parasol in her hand, on her lips an ambiguous smile, in which I read only the benign condescension of majesty, though it was preeminently the enticing smile of the courtesan, which she graciously bestowed upon the men who bowed to her. That smile was in reality saying to me, "Oh, yes, I do remember, quite well, it was wonderful," to another, "How I should have loved to, we were unfortunate," to a third, "Yes, if you like. I must just keep in the line for a minute, then as soon as I can I will break away." When strangers passed, she still allowed to linger about her lips a lazy smile, as though she expected or remembered some friend, which made them say, "What a lovely woman!" And for certain men only she had a sour, strained, shy, cold smile, which meant, "Yes, you old goat, I know that you've got a tongue like a viper, that you can't keep quiet for a moment, but do you suppose that I care what you say?" Coquelin passed, talking in a group of listening friends, and with a sweeping wave of his hand bade a theatrical good day to the people in the carriages. But I thought only of Madame Swann, and pretended to have not yet seen her, for I knew that when she reached the pigeon shooting ground, she would tell her coachman to break away and to stop the carriage, so that she might come back on foot. And on days when I felt that I had the courage to pass close by her, I would drag Françoise off in that direction, until the moment came when I saw Madame Swann letting trail behind her the long train of her lilac skirt, dressed, as the populace imagined queens to be dressed, in rich attire such as no other woman might wear, lowering her eyes now and then to study the handle of her parasol, paying scant attention to the passers-by, as though the important thing for her, her one object in being there, was to take exercise without thinking that she was seen, and that every head was turned towards her. Sometimes, however, when she had looked back to call her dog to her, she would cast almost imperceptibly a sweeping glance round about. End of Part 4, Section 5.